This episode is brought to you by Starbucks.
That is fire.
Whoa, that's good.
This might be the drink of the summer.
Okay, I like this one too. I'm rocking with it. Okay.
Try it for yourself. Starbucks Refreshers concentrates are coming home. Find them in the coffee aisle and make it yours.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. I am grateful today to speak with Anand Gopal, who has written what may be the definitive story of the revolution in modern Syria, told from the ground up. Days of Love and Rage, a story of ordinary people forging a revolution, throws us back into the heat and fire of the uprisings against Bashar al-Assad's repressive regime and the revolutionary movement that will come out of Assad's brutal crusade against those who protested against him. It is a history that reads like a novel, full of uncommon bravery by ordinary Syrians who refuse to bow down even when the state brings the worst kinds of violence to their door. Gopal draws for us an unforgettable portrait of the people of Manbij, Syria, who want what any group of citizens want: the ability to thrive by their own work, better the lives of their children, and build a community that looks out for its collective people rather than rewarding the privileged few. When this becomes impossible under Bashar's rule, they begin the hesitant but insistent moves towards protest, demanding basic needs and the care due from the sovereign to his people. Out of the seeds of this protest bloom a raging fire of resistance and then revolution. And in Gopal's hands, we move from citizen to look inside the torture prisons of Aleppo, the clashes between pro-government militias and protesters, and then to the birth of the free city of Manbij. It is there that Days of Love and Rage becomes the story of how democracies are born, in the stew and conflict of philosophical and religious debates around freedom and justice, rights and rules, and these remarkable gatherings of ordinary people there take on the characteristics of the great historical foundings of nations striving to be free. That painful birthing process is still going on today, and it is impossible to understand how it came to be without Anand Gopal's thoughtful and gorgeously wrought historical picture of a people in revolt. Anand Gopal is a writer for The New Yorker. He is the author of No Good Men Among the Living and writes about democracy, inequality, and conflict. Welcome to Burned by Books.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. This is such an incredible book. I just can't quite describe what it is like to read it because it feels truly as if you're sort of looking at ground level about the, many times extraordinary circumstances happening to quite ordinary people. And you feel so pulled into their everyday lives and conflicts. It's extraordinary. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you came to be able to have the information needed to give such an almost first person, even though it's third person, account of these people's lives. What was the research process like for you? How did you locate these people? And then how did you bring those narratives together into something that feels so novelistic?
Well, I was first interested in this story in 2016. This is after this democratic experiment that I described in the book failed. And I became interested in it because of the election here in the United States and the discourse around the Western world that there is something like a democratic backsliding. There was a question of why do democratic polities seem to be sliding towards some version of authoritarianism? So I got interested in looking at this question of democracy, not through the sort of typical approach, which is through a bird's eye view, but tried to see how this would look from the ground. And so I'd heard about the city of Manbij, and I started visiting after the events that were described and went to try to meet individuals who had took part in this 18th month experiment. In the beginning, I found that it was difficult to sometimes win people's trust. Sometimes it was challenging because...
I mean, these are people whose trust had been betrayed again and again and again.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And, they were also talking about events that happened a few years in the past. So I pretty quickly realized that it was more than just one person alone could really handle. And I started to recruit other Syrians who had taken part in the events, people from the city of Manbij, revolutionaries, people who had taken part in trying to build a democratic experiment, and recruited them as research assistants. And they fanned out across the country and really across the region to Turkey and to Europe to find people who had taken part in the events. And often these people were their own comrades, friends, lovers, etc. And so they were able to kind of break through the wall of distrust that I wasn't always able to break through. And eventually we collected something like 2,000 interviews over the course of 8 years. And so for every event, incident, and scene that's described in the book, I was fortunate to have at my fingertips hundreds of different accounts of them. And at the same time, there were also newspapers that were published during the revolution by revolutionaries that kind of detailed almost blow by blow, day by day, what was happening. So I had this really rich record to draw from. So I triangulated all these different sources to be able to produce the narrative.
Yeah, you note the newspaper pieces, and one of the things I really liked about the book is that we move from these sort of like almost oral histories into these snapshots of what a day would be like based on newspaper clippings from things like The Path and the Sun and what's the other one? Perspectives, or I forget the third one. And I wonder what it was like to gather up these newspaper clippings, and were they readily available, or was this something that was difficult to extract given the state of Syria at the time?
Well, just as some context, Syria was under dictatorship for 40 years. And so all forms of media were controlled by the state. There was no independent media, no free media. And then in the course of these 18 months that I describe in the book, when the government was overthrown in the city, all of a sudden there was this effervescence of free media. And these are basically just individuals who had no prior training in journalism or media, sometimes just handwriting newspapers or mimeographing it and handing it out on street corners. And there was everything from left-wing and liberal papers to conservative and Islamist papers. So you could walk through the streets in that time, and in every street corner, you'll find somebody hawking a different newspaper. And, the democratic experiment, as I describe in the book, ultimately is defeated, and all of the protagonists are scattered to the winds. So when I enter and I'm looking for these newspapers, it's quite difficult to find because
I imagine.
ISIS had taken over the city and banned these newspapers, had burned a lot of them. So I really me and my research colleagues had to go and really track people down. For example, there was one person who was in Britain who had a bunch of issues. Some people didn't even have the actual issues. They only had the PDFs that were, that would take to the printer on a flash drive. Through a couple of years of pretty meticulous scouring the globe, we were able to put together pretty much a full run of all these newspapers.
That's you reference the long dictatorship, and I think that most of my listeners will know that Bashar al-Assad was a heinous dictator who gassed and killed his own people, and he was known as the butcher. But in order to understand the modern history of Syria, you have to know about Bashar's father as well, and the transition that happens politically and in governance between father and son that you detail. Could you give us just a sort of brief glimpse into that history and that shift and what it's like for the people of Syria to experience that shift?
Yeah, sure. So coming out of the Second World War, where you had Syria and all these other Arab states that had newly won independence, you had extreme inequality, something like feudalism persisted in the countrysides. So these parties in Syria was the Ba'ath Party, there were other Arab nationalist parties in other countries, came to power really on a kind of populist program. They broke up the big feudal estates, redistributed land to the poor. And you had actually the rise of a middle class. There are millions of people moving to the cities and becoming teachers and engineers, the growth of literacy. So in exchange for all of those economic benefits, at the same time, people were forced to surrender any political rights. So this was the compact that was at the core of not just Syria, but the entire Arab region, which is that people would get a modicum of economic mobility and economic rights, but in exchange for no political rights whatsoever. Bashar al-Assad comes to power in 2000. He inherits a pretty aging economy and seeks to open the economy to private investment. He begins to privatize a lot of the key aspects that formed the social safety net of the society. So cutting subsidies for fuel, for healthcare, etc. So what this does is that it throws millions of people into penury. It creates widening inequality. People end up leaving the country as migrant workers working in the Gulf or in Jordan. So whereas before there was this compact where we would have some economic rights in exchange for surrendering political rights, now under Bashar, you had neither economic rights or political rights. And that was the basis that led to the uprisings that we call the Arab Spring in 2011.
That's really helpful. Bashar immediately, sort of after coming to power, privatizes all these major public institutions in the name of economic modernization. And it's interesting to see both how the kind of further deprivations of everyday economic life, but also in how the government kind of steals away these bases of community and kind of ways in which community can build itself up. And it's a familiar story that we hear far too often. And I wonder why you think Bashar moves to kind of privatize these institutions in the name of a kind of economic modernization.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, in the 70s and 80s, under his father, Hafez al-Assad, as there was this burgeoning middle class, as there was development, there was also a kind of contradiction in the economy, which is that, you know, to have a social safety net, you need to have taxation, you need to have revenue to be able to fund it. And yet there wasn't a strong business class that they can tax to do so. So there was various ways to try to solve this issue. One way is they try to just get aid from the Soviet Union, but then the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Then they try to turn to oil revenue, but that doesn't really work out. So then when Bashar assumes power in 2000, he basically is facing a growing population, especially a youth bulge, people who are expecting entitlements, expecting basic safety net, but without the means of really paying for it. And so this is what leads to the turn towards privatization in the hopes that this can jumpstart the economy. Now, the problem was, though, that this also cut a hole in the safety net, and this let millions of people fall to poverty.
So you have incredible portraits of the folks in Manbij. One of my favorites is Abul Os, you know, not for much larger reasons, but also because he's a karate instructor and his name sounds like the sound you make in karate, Os, which I think is amazing. And he's a town problem solver and sort of falls into line when Bashar comes into power. But he eventually will become a major figure in the revolution. Would you tell us a little bit about the amazing Abul Os and a little bit about how his story mirrors the story of many of the key revolutionaries that you profile?
So Abul Os comes from a working class family. He's a Kurd. He grows up working in a little roadside stand, and his dream is to turn this roadside stand into a shop. And that was a reasonable dream growing up in the 90s because, as I mentioned earlier, people had the expectation that if you worked hard and played by the rules, kept your head down, that you could expect a better life for your children. But with the economic reforms of Bashar al-Assad, that promise became unmet. And so you had a whole generation of people who were working hard, trying to play by the rules, but their children's lives were no better than theirs. And so Abalos is an exemplar of this because he struggles to try to build his shop up. He ends up in debt and ultimately loses everything and is forced to live out a precarious existence as a migrant worker in Lebanon. He eventually comes back home to Manbij when the protests start. And he's kind of like an everyman, kind of ear to the street type of guy. So he finds that his métier is getting people together and protesting, and becomes a very important leader in the revolution. And ultimately, when the protesters succeed in overthrowing the dictator in their city, he becomes a very important figure in the revolutionaries' attempt to govern themselves.
Yeah, I loved his story, and I also found that he was both extraordinary, but also indicative of a kind of just relentless ability to recover from horrible disadvantage and violence that you find in a lot of these people that you're profiling, that they go through some of the worst things imaginable and still hold on to the idea that perhaps change is possible. Was that something that really surprised you in your research, and the fact that you kept finding more and more people who were telling a story that they had gone through just extraordinary horrors, but were still had some glimmer of hope?
Yeah, I mean, Abalos is an example of this, where when he becomes a protester, he's arrested by the Syrian regime, imprisoned, tortured pretty horrifically. I mentioned he gets out, but then continues protesting. Then he's later arrested by ISIS and again gets out. Even towards the very end, and he does pass away at the end of the book, but towards the very end, he's somebody who held out hope that all of their sacrifices were not for naught, that ultimately the dictator would fall. And yeah, I was very much struck by the resilience that I saw in people again and again. And, maybe there's something we as Americans can learn from this, because these are people who've gone through extraordinary experiences and still show remarkable degrees of resilience. Now, if we think about why they have that resilience, in part, the struggles, Abalos going to prison, being imprisoned twice and torture, that wasn't a solitary struggle. That wasn't something that he alone had faced. He had gone into that experience along with thousands of other people, friends, comrades. And I think there is something to the idea that when people suffer together, it gives a kind of resilience to it. There's a way you can understand it. Whereas you're suffering alone and atomized, it's much harder to stand on 2 feet after that.
That suffering is something that you detail in very vivid terms in Days of Love and Rage. And there are scenes of imprisonment and torture that you describe from firsthand accounts, many in the notorious prisons of Aleppo. And the extremity of the violence and brutality endured by the prisoners is unimaginable. In particular, you describe scenes of the prison where everyone must constantly be looking upwards all the time to prevent ever looking at a guard or the physical prison itself. And this combined with a sleep regime in which no sounds can be made and only one position of sleep is allowed, lest there be group beatings. What was it like hearing about these experiences? And did you have trouble writing in such a vivid way about such inhuman torture?
Well, of course, it was difficult to hear about these things. It was sometimes shocking to see what humans can do to fellow humans. But, I have to say, for every horrific story like that, there was also a story of solidarity and kindness that one would also hear. Even small acts, prisoners sharing, saving some of their food to feed one of the sicker inmates, people risking their lives for each other during the protests and during the revolution. So I think, in the abstract, just seeing the torture, one could feel despair, but then there's the flip side to the torture, which is that people were again and again, and there's a story here of revolution in which people were again and again sacrificing for each other, for something greater than themselves. And, we have to be able to sit with both of those ideas. Both we humans are capable of both. And I think what the book tries to show is that both of those can live even in the same society, in the same city.
I wish I could say that that Syria was in some way singular in its brutality, but this is such a common story that regimes move so quickly to these levels of brutality. I think the UN estimates that over 100,000 people were killed or disappeared during the regime. Did you have any window opened for you as to why humans in our way of kind of governing ourselves are so quick to turn to this level of inhumanity? Did your picture of Syria open up a sense of a kind of more global understanding of why we do this to each other?
Well, a lot of the violence is meted out by middling bureaucrats, prison guards, and often they were trying to just work their way through the system, trying to get a promotion, trying to, if you really look at just from their point of view, trying to get a promotion so they can provide better for their families. And I think of Hannah Arendt here, Vanellope people, they kind of were following rules and turned their brains off in a sense, to do this. And again, though, as that was happening, as you can see the Assad regime, the Chernobyl house that was the houses that were the prisons, where you see the worst of humanity, truly. At the same time, you had thousands of people overthrowing this system and trying to build something much better from scratch. And there's really, I think the fact that both of those are happening simultaneously, to me, is more of the universal story. I think it is easy sometimes just to look at the terrible side and say, oh, wow, well, you just put a bureaucracy in place and you get enough people who will just follow orders and then any terrible thing can happen. But at the same time, they didn't succeed in the end, right? It took some 40, 50 years. The regime was very good at manipulating people's fears. We tend to do better as humans when we're not afraid, when we feel secure, and the regime was able to keep people afraid. And when you have people who are afraid, then they become docile. And the kind of turning point in the protest is when people realize they no longer have to be afraid. And that's ultimately what led to a process that took maybe, 15 years or 14 years, but led to the overthrow of the dictator.
Yeah.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This is what everyone's talking about.
Everything's on the table.
This is what champions come to take. This is what everyone came to see.
And the slam!
No do-overs. No second chances. No more Mr. Nice Guy. This is winner take all. The NBA Finals continue on ABC and the ESPN app.
Hey, I like your new RAV4.
Thanks, yours too.
What does RAV stand for anyway?
To me, it's the Remarkably Advanced Vehicle.
Really? To me, it's the Runway Approved Vehicle for its amazing style.
What about Remarkably Adaptable Vehicle because of its versatile cargo space?
Or Really Admired Vehicle?
Oh, or Really Awesome Vehicle.
It really is the recreational activity vehicle. The stylish 2026 Toyota RAV4 Limited. What's your RAV4?
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
There are so many, as I've said, remarkable stories in this book. One that feels particularly cinematic to me is the transformation of First Lieutenant Memati. For much of the first quarter of the book, Memati is a local police chief, notable mostly for his cruelty and arrogance. But the violence against protesters causes him to become a rebel. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about Memati's story and transformation. It feels almost too novelistic to be true, and yet here he is.
Yes, yeah, he's a very interesting individual. He was a police chief for the city of Manbij in the 2000s. And when the protests started, he was tasked with keeping law and order, which means basically brutalizing the protesters and sending them off to prison. Yeah, he was also at the same time kind of sort of a dashing figure. He wore the aviator sunglasses and epaulettes, and it was seen around town. And actually, his name Memati, it's a nom de guerre. He takes it from a Turkish soap, and he saw himself as this kind of vigilante for justice. But he was a chief of police. Now, he was carrying out orders. He was probably turned his brain off and was just doing what he was told in the early parts of the uprising. But he was somebody who could not live with the fact that he was brutalizing unarmed protesters who were basically his neighbors. The narrative the regime was promoting during the early part of the protests is that the protesters are all terrorists, they're agent provocateurs, they're connected to the CIA, they're connected to outside agents. But he and anybody who was there could see at the time that, well, actually, no, these are just my friends and neighbors. I know these people, I play soccer with them. And so that dissonance, he couldn't live with it. And at some point, he decided to start supporting the protesters surreptitiously. Eventually,
and they can't believe it. They think it's all a ruse.
Yeah, understandably. This is the guy that was beating you just 3 weeks before. But there's a lot of stories like this, actually, some in the book and some I didn't even include in the book, where people undergo pretty drastic transformations. I think it's easy sometimes for us here in the US to think about ideology in a very fixed way. And this person is right wing, left wing, etc. But when you get put through the ringer of real life and have pretty intense experiences, you can be surprised how people will change, how people's basic ideas will change. And he's just one example of that. So he becomes a rebel leader.
Did you, by any chance, read the Chilean novel The Twilight Zone by Nona Fernandez?
I have not, no.
It reminded me in some ways of Memati's story because it fictionalizes a true account of agent of the Pinochet regime who comes forward during that period of the coup and admits to having tortured people and essentially becomes a voice for the rebellion. I think you'd like it very much.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So the city of Manbij becomes a kind of city-state during the height of the revolutionary movement. And while it's still bombarded by the state military, a movement of true revolutionary ideas takes place. You write about the hothouse of these debates around how government can best serve the common good while protecting individual rights. There's real sort of debate and discussion around freedom versus justice and how to preserve certain natural rights with or without religion at the center of them. And it feels like we're watching scenes of founding fathers of a new nation with, unfortunately, a very unhappy ending, at least for that moment in the revolution. But I wondered if you'd take us into the scenes that generated that intellectual hothouse.
So once the protesters managed to overthrow the government in their city, this is July 2012, all of a sudden they're faced with the fact that now they have a city of 150,000 people. They have to figure out how to keep the streetlights on, how to keep the schools running, how to keep the hospitals running. And so they form councils to try to do so. And there's a revolutionary council that runs the city. Now, during the period of protest, when the dictator was still in power, everyone was marching in favor of freedom, right? And they were braving bullets and getting tortured. Abul Os was getting tortured because of this ideal of freedom. Now that the dictator has been overthrown and the city's independent and liberated, now the question arose, well, what does freedom mean? It's actually a pretty complicated word, and it can mean different things to different people. And what happens over time is that there emerges in the city two currents of thought on what does freedom mean. So one current says that freedom is personal freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of markets. Basically, freedom means being left alone by the government. And this was primarily espoused by wealthier segments of society. And there was another current that said, well, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly is great, but we are facing what is essentially an affordability crisis in our city. Food cost of bread is going sky high, or fuel. in this period, thousands of Syrians are fleeing other cities and moving to Manbij as an independent city-state. So that means the population's growing and the cost of rent is really going high. So working class families are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. So people from more working class backgrounds are saying, well, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, that's great. But freedom of markets, I don't know. Maybe we need to have rent controls. Maybe we need to have some price controls. Maybe we need to change the tax regime so that the wealthier citizens of our city pay their fair share. So there's these two different versions of freedom that kind of were at the core of all of these debates. And then the second set of debates that emerged was around the question of security, like physical security. How do we best maintain law and order? Then there was a question of religion. What kind of polity do we want to have? Should it be secular, that in the sense that everybody should be free to practice their own religion as long as they keep it to themselves? Or should it be more overtly religious? And there were many adherents on both sides having these debates. And the remarkable thing about it is, these were not the people having these debates. These were, for the most part, not political theorists or, university professors. They were bricklayers and cobblers and, ordinary people who had never encountered these ideas ever before, but purely because of the exigencies of having to try to build a democracy from scratch, were forced to contend with these ideas and began to articulate for themselves what this might mean and began to debate with each other. And that's what the book tries to show, is how these debates emerged.
And they get to the root questions that have been, at the center of questions about democracy from the Greeks onward. They are fully invested in the hardest questions that face, those who seek democracy, whether, you will fall to the tyranny of the majority or the minority, or whether you will be able to have some understanding of kind of basic and natural rights that are preserved, even as you have a popular or populist government. And it's truly extraordinary. And you reference the way in which those of great religious faith are in this conversation. And I think one of the ways in which, at least from the US perspective, everything is kind of reduced to these kind of gross black and white terms. But if you're thinking about the way in which secularism is talked about in these conversations, it's also often talked about by people who are themselves very devoutly religious, at least in the sort of like cultural understanding about how Islam kind of governs their lives and morals, but they're trying to think through what it would mean to be able to have a space for all people, believers and unbelievers, in a democratic society. What changes, I think, is from the way that you describe it, the arrival of ISIS, who show up first as a kind of like really tiny little presence in Manbij, but start to have extraordinary demands about how Sharia law will be implemented. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how ISIS really changes the debate.
Yeah, so the city is divided between these, broadly speaking, between these two camps: the ones who think freedom means to be left alone, and those who think, no, we should have, so the state should provide for its citizens and put some, price controls and rent controls, etc. And also divided on the question of crime. Should have a state have a heavier hand in trying to stop crime or not? Into this divide, 6 individuals who are not from Syria, they're from other Arab countries, but who have traveled to Syria. They show up in Manbij, they set up shop, and they look at the divisions in the city. And what they do is very adroitly try to manipulate those divisions. They go to the poor and working class segments of society and say, look, these people who run the city, the revolutionaries who are running the city, who are talking about, personal freedom, this and that and the other thing, these are foreign ideas. They're getting these ideas from the West. These people, these elites, they actually would call them liberal elites. These liberal elites have foreign ideas which they're imposing onto our city. And that's why our city's in such a mess. That's why you're afraid to send your daughter to school because of kidnapping. That's why you can't put food on the table, because they're importing these foreign ideas. Actually, we have the resources in our own tradition to be able to confront these problems. And our tradition is Islam, and particularly the Islam of the early period right after the Prophet. They claimed that in that era, there was no rich or poor. You could leave your house, you could leave your doors unlocked at night. There was no crime. And we've forgotten that way of living. We've forgotten this more communitarian way of living. one that was ordered to the prerogatives of faith for these Western ideas. So what we want to do is kind of return to that, and that'll solve the problems of the city. And this was a message that resonated with people because they were facing real problems. They were facing real issues with crime. They were facing a real economic crisis. And people were looking for answers. And so slowly what was started as just 6 individuals went to 20, 30, 100, and they built this constituency that ultimately became the most powerful political force in the city. Ultimately, they were able to overthrow the democracy from within, largely through political persuasion, not really voluntarily.
Yeah, it feels so tragic, and yet the way you lay it out, you can see the glimmers and shadows of how it's going to happen, because they really are quite politically able as a group. They really, as you say, do see the seeds of discontent and just know how to turn the screw just a little bit to make people's discontent turn into support for them. And it's really it's very depressing to watch it happen.
Right.
One of my favorite stories in Days of Love and Rage concerns Mina and the women of freedom in Manbij. Mina's story is one of taking agency in entering the revolutionary fray despite the cultural and religious barriers to her having a role. I might call that a feminist movement, but I'm not sure Mina would call it that. And I wonder how you would describe this women's movement within the revolution.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So Mina is somebody who joins the protest because she sees her brother being brutalized by the regime, and she eventually becomes a revolutionary herself. Now, the important context here is that Manbij is a fairly conservative city, even within with respect to other cities in Syria. Like you think of Damascus and Aleppo or the more cosmopolitan cities. Manbij is a fairly conservative city, tribal city, and Mina, like other revolutionary women, realized pretty quickly that they're facing or fighting a two-front battle. On the one hand, of course, they're fighting against the regime, but on the other hand, also against the patriarchal attitudes of their own comrades, their friends, their brothers, their spouses, etc. So, Mina creates this group called the Women of Freedom, which is trying to wage at both those struggles at once. Yeah, I don't know, would she consider herself feminist? But sure. But she was very much locally thinking about how can we get women a voice in this city, which was being revolutionary ranks are being dominated by men. And then there are other groups that split and go even further in that direction. There's one group called Girls of Tomorrow, which said we should not only try to have a role in governing the city, we should also be fighting on the front lines against So it ran the gamut, but Mina definitely was kind of the heart and soul, I think, of the women's movement in the city. And after the democratic experiment collapses and ISIS takes over the city, and people earlier, they kind of were supporting ISIS because they wanted law and order, they wanted some economic stability. But now, with the horrific dictatorship that ISIS has imposed, now people are having having doubts, right? And saying maybe this was the wrong move. It's Mina and the Women of Freedom who really try to lead a struggle against ISIS and actually succeed in carrying out a general strike against ISIS. So they show remarkable heroism and bravery in trying to stand up against one of the most brutal political forces in the region, whereas the men were often unable to do so.
Yeah, it's an amazing story and a book full of extraordinary stories. I wonder, having written this book and now sort of looking at where Syria is today, how does the revolution that ultimately was able to overthrow Assad, how does it differ from the one that you profile here? And what do you think when you imagine the possibilities that could have been in the democratic hothouse of debate in Manbij versus where we are now in Syria?
So the democratic experiment detailed in the book, which was 18 months from 2012 to 2014, it was really like a small d democracy. It was participatory democracy, meaning democracy from the ground up. You had councils, you had various political groupings called assemblies, newspapers. It was really, as you say, a hothouse of political expression. What's happening today is a little different. Now, it's only because of movements like what I described in Manbij that ultimately the regime fell. But a rebel group took power, and now the rebel group is controlling the country. The situation today in Syria is much better than it was under Assad, but still, the people in power would-be authoritarians. If they had their way, I think they would like to impose strict limits on freedom of speech and assembly, etc. But as part of the legacy of the decade-long struggle against a dictator, the current rulers are not able to do so. So you do have freedom of speech right now in Syria. You do have different newspapers, and people are able to criticize the rulers. And so that is there. But, I think if you talk to some of the protagonists of the revolution, that they recognize that the cause for freedom, for democracy, is not something that's like a one-off. It's not something that happens in one moment, but it's a perpetual struggle. And sometimes there are steps forward, sometimes there are steps backwards. The overthrow of Assad was definitely a step forward. Certainly in the future, there's going to be steps backwards. But the memory and the lessons that were learned from the struggle are vital to what they hope ultimately being in a place where they can have a real democracy.
That's beautifully said. I have so much more to ask you, but just in the need to bring this to a close, I wanted to ask if you have some books that you've read recently that you might want to recommend to my listeners.
Well, yeah, a couple. One, if you read my book and you're interested in more on Syria, there's a beautiful book out right now by Lubna Murray called Defiance, and it's a story of this young woman who it's a memoir. She stands against her father, who supports the Syrian regime, and risks everything to go and protest. And it's really an extraordinary tale of resilience.
I'm definitely going to read that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. Another one I read recently, which is an old one, but I think I'll mention it just since probably it has been forgotten. It's a wonderful little book called Orality and Literacy. And what it is, it's by Walter Ong, and it's a book that looks at cultures that don't have the written word and how they think differently from cultures that have the written word. And starting from the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were both written, not meant to be read, meant to be listened to. Even the Quran as something meant to be listened to. There's old cultures that have an oral way of thinking, and the way in which literacy has changed how we think, not necessarily for the worse, also for the better in some ways, but differently at least. It's one of those eye-opening reads where you will look at books very differently after you read this book.
That sounds fascinating. I think those are wonderful recommendations. I can't recommend enough Days of Love and Rage, a story of ordinary people forging a revolution. I thank you for writing this book. I just feel like I was really changed by reading it, and I feel like I understand something about how a revolution of ordinary people can come about in an extraordinary time, and it helps me to understand the moment in Syria, but also so many other kind of revolutionary moments. And it was a pleasure to get to talk to you about it, Anand.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Thank you. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Anand Gopal for coming on to talk about his story of everyday Syrians fighting for a revolution, Days of Love and Rage. You can find links to purchase Days of Love and Rage and all of Anand's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.
Stitch Fix. Stop shopping, get styled.
A+ on the outfit, Miss Turner. You are about to slay parent-teacher conferences.
Oh, these?
just the most perfect fitting jeans my stylist sent me.
Oh, hello, you, who didn't set one foot in a mall and still looks amazing.
Just share your size, style, and budget, and your stylist sends personalized looks right to your door. Stitch Fix. Get started today at stitchfix.com. To my stylist. This look is dedicated to you. Thank you. Thank you.